I stayed perfectly still until the sound finally faded. Hours passed like that, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making me flinch. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I peered out cautiously. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone. Nothing but my own fire pit and the disturbed ground where I had laid my tent. I packed quickly, deciding to leave early. Something about the night had unsettled me beyond reason. I tore down the tent, shoved everything into my pack, and started down the trail. The forest felt different in daylight, less oppressive but still watching. I moved faster now, my legs burning from the weight of the pack, my mind on alert for anything unusual. Halfway down the trail, I saw them. Footprints. Human, too big to be a child, heavy, fresh. They weren't the kind of footprints you see from a hiker or camper. These were deliberate, careful, like someone was moving silently through the forest. And they led straight to my campsite. My stomach sank. Whoever had walked around my tent in the night had left without making a sound, but had been right there, inches from where I had slept. I didn't stop. I moved as quickly as I could, ignoring the sweat and the pain in my shoulders and legs. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone step out, but there was nothing. By midday, I reached the main trail and then the forest road. I could see my car, parked exactly where I had left it. Relief hit me in waves. I loaded everything into the trunk, locked the doors, and drove off without looking back. Even now, days later, I can still feel that presence, the knowledge that someone had been close enough to touch me in the night and never revealed themselves. I tell myself it was just another camper, a ranger, someone like me, but I know the truth. I was not alone in that forest, and I never planned to go back. The first day of my trip had begun with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The forest spread out before me like a deep green ocean, trees thick and high, the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor. I had planned this solo camping trip for weeks. I needed space to think, to get away from work, from people, from the constant hum of life that never seemed to stop. My backpack was heavy, filled with supplies, a tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, and tools. Everything I might need for 3 days in the wilderness. I told myself I was prepared. I told myself I could handle it. The hike to the clearing I had chosen was tougher than I expected. The trail disappeared at times, covered by fallen leaves or branches. Moss grew thick on tree trunks and stones, making the ground slippery. Every so often, I would stumble over a hidden root or slide on loose dirt. My legs were sore within the first hour, my back stiff from the weight of the pack. I had to stop more than once to catch my breath. Yet, the deeper I went, the quieter it became. Not the peaceful quiet you might imagine, but a heavy, watchful quiet. Birds occasionally called to each other, distant and sharp, but there was no wind, no movement except my own steps. The silence was tangible, pressing against my ears. When I finally reached the clearing around mid-afternoon, I dropped my pack and just looked around. It was a small, open area with soft earth, surrounded by trees that seemed almost to close in from all sides. A small creek ran on one edge, the water clear but moving fast over rocks. Perfect, I thought. I had read that finding a water source close to your campsite was essential. I unpacked the tent first. The nylon felt strange under my fingers, stiff and new. The poles were heavier than I expected. I struggled for a while to get it up, and it leaned slightly to one side. I didn't have time to fix it perfectly, but I told myself it was stable enough. I started collecting firewood next. Dry sticks were hard to find. Most of the forest floor was damp, and the occasional broken branch was still wet inside. After some searching, I managed to gather enough small branches and twigs to build a fire. I arranged them carefully in a small pit I dug myself, the earth dark and soft beneath my hands. When I struck a match and the flame caught, I felt a brief surge of triumph. Smoke rose straight into the still air, curling among the branches. I watched it for a while, listening to the crackle of burning wood. It was peaceful, but the silence beyond the fire felt heavier. Night fell quickly. I wasn't used to the dark coming this early, but here it arrived without warning, the sky turning black behind the thick tree canopy. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, dried rice with some canned beans and ate slowly, savoring every bite. As I cleaned up, the first noises began. Small, distant sounds at first. The scuffing of animals in the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, but it reminded me that I wasn't alone. I felt exposed, sitting in the center of the clearing, surrounded by trees I couldn't see through. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, I was exhausted. The forest felt alive around me, shadows stretching long and strange in the firelight. I checked my knife and flashlight before closing my eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a deer called. I could hear the water running in the creek, soothing and constant. My breathing slowed, and I finally drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my stomach drop. It wasn't the creek, it wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal I could recognize. It was something heavier, deliberate. Footsteps. Not on the trail, not near the creek, but close, very close. My heart raced. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the location. They were coming from just beyond my fire pit, somewhere in the dark. I froze, every nerve alert. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe another camper had set up nearby, maybe a ranger checking trails. But the footsteps were uneven, cautious, slow. Someone, or something, was circling my tent. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make noise. When I clicked it on, the beam cut across the clearing, illuminating nothing but the trees and the dark edges of the forest. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence and the distant creak. I held my breath, gripping my knife under the sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. Then the footsteps began again, closer this time, moving around the tent, circling it as if testing, probing. By the time I reached my camp, the sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. I hurried to set up my tent again, though I had already broken camp that morning. I reinforced it, secured all my gear inside, and built a fire, making sure it was large enough to deter anything from coming close. I kept my knife on the ground beside me, my flashlight within reach. The forest was alive with sounds now. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional call of a bird. But there was also something else. The occasional snap of a branch, faint but deliberate, like someone walking just outside the clearing. I could feel eyes on me. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, watching the dark tree line, listening to every sound, my heart hammering in my chest. Every rustle made me jump. Every shadow made me flinch. I didn't dare leave the fire, and I didn't dare make any sudden movements. I felt trapped, completely exposed, and utterly alone. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. My plan was to pack up quickly and get out of there. I ate a small breakfast and double-checked my gear. I had a long hike ahead to reach the main trail and the parking lot. I moved fast, trying to stay calm, but every step felt tense. The forest seemed alive in a way that made me uneasy. I kept thinking about the footprints, about the movement I had seen the day before. I told myself it was probably just a bear or a large animal, nothing intelligent, nothing that could plan or track me. But even telling myself that didn't stop the knot in my stomach from tightening. A few hours into my hike, I heard something I will never forget. A low, guttural growl, not far ahead, from the trees. I froze. My heart nearly stopped. I scanned the area, trying to see what made the sound. There was movement. Something large, something with a presence that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It wasn't a bear, at least not one I had seen before. It moved silently, deliberately. I could feel it watching me. I debated running, but my legs felt like lead. My survival instinct kicked in, and I started to move slowly, carefully, keeping the sun at my back so I could see it if it tried to come toward me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but it stayed just out of sight, always there, always following. As the hours passed, I realized I had made a mistake. I had underestimated the danger of being alone in the wilderness. My water was running low, my energy was depleting, and I was exhausted from fear and constant vigilance. I finally reached a small creek, hoping to refill my bottle. As I bent down, I saw tracks again, huge, deliberate, leading directly to the creek. My heart sank. I realized then that I wasn't just being followed by an animal. I was being tracked by something intelligent, something large enough to leave footprints that terrified me. I couldn't understand what it was, but instinctively, I knew it wasn't something I could fight. My only chance was to keep moving and hope I could reach a place with other people. The next few hours were a blur. I moved quickly, barely stopping, following the trail as best I could. The sun was high now, but the forest was dense, shadows hiding everything. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept going. I didn't look back. Every so often, I heard the snapping of branches, the crunch of leaves. I didn't stop to see what it was. I just kept moving. I had to survive. Finally, I saw it, the edge of the forest, the clearing where the main trail ran. I could see the parking lot in the distance, a small glimmer of safety. My pace quickened. I ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, scraping my hands and knees, ignoring the pain. I didn't care. I had to get out. I emerged from the forest and saw another hiker on the trail. Relief hit me like a wave. I waved frantically, hoping they could help, hoping they could call for someone. I ran toward the parking lot, my legs shaking, my chest heaving. The presence that had been stalking me didn't appear. Maybe it hadn't followed me out of the dense forest. Maybe it had stayed hidden. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I reached my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I drove to the nearest ranger station, reported everything, and waited for someone to take me seriously. They took my story, inspected the area, and agreed the tracks were unusual, larger than a bear, deeper than I would have expected for any wild animal. They assured me that the forest could be dangerous and remote, and that encounters like mine, while rare, could happen. That night, safe in a motel, I replayed everything over and over in my head. The fear, the isolation, the constant sense of being watched. It left a scar, but I survived. I made mistakes, but I made it out. I learned to respect the wilderness in a way I never had before, to never underestimate it, and to understand that sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just waits, silent, watching, testing you until you find a way to survive. I still think about that forest, the lake, the ridge, the sound of branches snapping when no one should have been there. It stays with me, a memory of fear and awareness that I carry now. But I also carry the knowledge that I survived, that I trusted my instincts, and that I never gave up, even when the forest itself seemed against me. That experience changed the way I look at the world, at wilderness, and at myself. I respect the quiet now, the isolation, the solitude, because I know that even in the most beautiful places, danger can be real, and survival is about awareness, caution, and never underestimating what might be out there, just beyond sight. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything. The constant noise of the city, the endless notifications, the people always demanding attention. I needed a place where I could hear myself think, where I could disappear into the quiet and the woods, and for a few days, I could just exist without anyone watching or expecting anything from me. I had chosen a national forest that I had read about in a few blogs and hiking forums. It was supposed to be remote but accessible, with several small lakes and some trails that went deep into untouched woods. The more I researched, the more perfect it seemed. I had my backpack, my tent, my sleeping bag, plenty of food, a stove, a headlamp, and an emergency first aid kit. I told myself I was ready for anything. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, and the air smelled like early autumn, dry leaves, pine needles, and the faint, almost sweet scent of wet soil. I parked my car, checked my gear one last time, and began hiking up the trail. The path was narrow, lined with thick bushes and tall trees that formed a canopy above me, filtering the sunlight into scattered golden beams. The sound of my boots crunching against the forest floor was strangely comforting, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Birds chirped in the distance, and somewhere far off, I heard the sound of running water. The first day passed without incident. I set up my camp near a small clearing beside a stream. The water was clear and cold, and I spent an hour just sitting by it, washing my hands and filling my water bottle. I gathered firewood and built a small campfire. As night fell, I cooked my dinner over the flames, a simple meal of canned beans and rice. The warmth of the fire and the smell of the food were comforting. I watched the sparks rise into the dark sky, thinking about how isolated I was, and yet how alive the forest felt. That night, I slept well, lulled to sleep by the gentle sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The next morning, I woke early. The air was chilly, and a thin mist clung to the trees. I packed up my camp, leaving no trace behind, and decided to follow a trail that led deeper into the forest, toward a small lake I had read about. The trail was steeper now, and the trees grew denser. The light dimmed as I walked, and the sounds of the forest changed. The birds had gone quiet, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of something unsettled. I ignored the feeling at first, telling myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity. By midday, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, more secluded than I had imagined, surrounded by tall pines and rocky outcrops. The water was dark, reflecting the sky and trees like glass. I decided to rest here, sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge. I ate a snack, drank some water, and simply watched the lake. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect, like it was waiting for something to disturb it. As I started back on the trail, I noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the dirt, large, heavy, not human. They were fresh. I froze, trying to calm my racing heart. The forest was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I traced the footprints back to where I had come from. They were deep, as if whatever made them was very heavy, and they moved parallel to the trail, disappearing into the undergrowth. I thought about turning back, but a stubborn part of me insisted I continue. I tried to convince myself it was probably just a deer or some other large animal. The trail twisted and turned, and I kept my eyes on the ground, scanning for more signs. By late afternoon, I reached a fork in the trail. I checked my map and compass. One path led uphill toward a ridge that overlooked the lake. The other continued along the shore. I decided to take the ridge, thinking the view would be worth the effort. The climb was steep, and my legs ached, but I kept going. When I reached the top, the view was stunning. The lake looked tiny from up here, surrounded by thick forest, completely isolated. But that's when I saw it. A movement in the trees below, near the trail I had taken to get here. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it was too deliberate, too careful. It moved slowly, almost stalking. My stomach tightened. I couldn't see clearly, but I had the undeniable sense that something was following me. I tried to stay calm. I checked my gear, making sure my knife was within reach and my flashlight was ready. I decided to descend quickly, taking the trail along the ridge that led back toward my camp. I moved carefully, placing my feet deliberately, trying not to make noise, but I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The forest seemed different now, darker, more oppressive. The wind rustled the leaves, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or if it was masking other sounds. Every time I looked back, I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting between the trees. My imagination was running wild, but the footprints earlier made me doubt myself. I felt hunted. The path to the next clearing was difficult. I had to climb over fallen logs and navigate around patches of dense undergrowth. The forest felt different now, less welcoming somehow. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the wind, every rustle of leaves. My mind conjured explanations, but it didn't calm me. I reached the second site by late afternoon. This clearing was larger, flatter, with a small pond nearby. It seemed safer, more open. I set up the tent again, made another fire, and tried to relax. But the feeling from the previous night lingered. Every crackle in the fire, every gust of wind through the trees, set my nerves on edge. I kept checking the perimeter, moving slowly, deliberately, always scanning. That night, the noises returned. Crunching, snapping, deliberate footsteps circling the clearing. My heart pounded. I had no weapon, no real protection. The flashlight did little more than illuminate tiny patches of the woods around me. I debated leaving immediately, hiking back to my car in the dark, but the thought of navigating the dense forest at night terrified me even more. Hours passed. The footsteps grew bolder, closer, almost brushing against the edge of the firelight. I stayed as still as possible, breathing shallowly. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I waited, tense, until the first light of dawn. When I emerged from the tent, I found something I hadn't expected. Footprints. Human footprints, large, muddy, circling the clearing. Someone had been there all night. Fear surged through me, but so did determination. I packed my gear with meticulous care, making sure nothing was left behind. Every noise, every movement kept me alert. I took the trail back the way I had come, scanning constantly. I didn't encounter anyone directly, but the forest felt hostile, oppressive, as if it knew I had been alone and vulnerable. I made it back to my car late that afternoon. The road was quiet, empty, as if no one had been there all week. I checked the vehicle thoroughly before getting in, locking the doors, starting the engine, and driving off slowly, eyes constantly scanning the treeline. The unease stayed with me, lingering for days afterward, a shadow in the back of my mind. Eventually, I reported the footprints to the Park Service. They told me that the area had seen reports of people living illegally in the woods, squatters who avoided detection and moved quietly. Nothing dangerous, they said, but the realization that someone had been watching me, circling my campsite all night, changed my perception entirely. I had not been alone. I had been exposed in ways I had never imagined. The experience changed how I approached solitude. I still camped alone, but I chose well-traveled areas, kept my phone charged and within reach, and always informed someone of my exact location. I never let my guard down again. That night in the deep woods remained a stark reminder of the vulnerability of isolation. Nature was beautiful, serene, even calming, but it was also indifferent, sometimes dangerous, and filled with unknown presences. I had survived, and in doing so, I learned a lesson I would never forget. Preparation and awareness were not just useful, they were essential. I had always enjoyed camping alone. There was a quiet comfort in the isolation, a chance to step away from everything familiar and exist only in the rhythm of nature. This time, I chose a spot deeper in the woods than I had ever gone before, a place I had read about in old forums, where the trail was rough and few people ventured. The map I had studied for weeks indicated a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick pines and scrub oaks, far enough from the nearest road to guarantee solitude. I wanted that isolation. I wanted to see if I could handle being entirely alone, depending only on myself. I arrived in the late morning. The trail had been rough, narrow in places, and littered with fallen branches and rocks. My legs were sore, my boots worn from the hike, and my backpack heavy with supplies. The weight was comforting in a strange way. It reminded me I was prepared. I had packed a small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, enough food for 3 days, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and some basic tools. I had considered bringing a small knife as well, though I tried not to think too much about why exactly I felt the need for it. The clearing was smaller than I had imagined, but perfect for my purpose. The ground was slightly uneven, scattered with pine needles and fallen leaves. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating shifting patterns that moved with the wind. I set up the tent, making sure to position it so that the opening faced the creek. Water was a necessity, and having it visible from my shelter offered some reassurance. By the time I had finished, the sun was past its peak, but there was enough light to gather firewood and prepare for the evening. As I collected wood, I noticed that the forest was unusually quiet. There were the standard sounds, birds chirping, the occasional rustle of small animals, but no larger noises. No distant traffic, no airplanes, no human voices. Just the wind in the trees and the sound of my own movements. It was a quiet I wasn't entirely comfortable with. I shrugged it off. Part of camping alone was embracing that quiet, letting it fill me rather than frighten me. The fire went up without difficulty. I stacked the wood carefully, making sure to leave room to add more if needed. As the flames caught, the smell of burning pine filled the air. I boiled some water, ate a simple meal, and cleaned up carefully, burying scraps and packing away anything that might attract wildlife. When night fell, it was almost complete darkness. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. That's when I heard it. First, I thought it was just the wind, a cracking sound, like a branch snapping. But then it came again, closer this time, deliberate, a crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze. My heart began to race, and I told myself to calm down. This was the forest. Animals moved at night. Deer, maybe a bear, though the latter was unlikely given the area. I had read that most wildlife would avoid humans, and I reassured myself of that. I unzipped the tent slightly and peered out, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light of the moon. Nothing, just the black shapes of trees and the faint reflection of the creek. Still, the sound persisted, sometimes close, sometimes further away, but always around me. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the crunching had a rhythm now. Someone or something was moving deliberately through the woods. Panic began to creep in. I tried to focus on rational explanations. Perhaps it was a hiker, though the nearest trail was far, and few people ventured this deep. Perhaps it was an animal after all, but the deliberate movements sounded too intentional, too calculated. I grabbed my flashlight and prepared to step outside, just to get a look, but hesitation held me back. There was no need to confront something I might not be able to handle. I settled back, trying to stay quiet, listening for any indication of what might be nearby. Hours passed. Each rustle, each snap of a twig made my chest tighten. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, always interrupted by the noises outside. At some point, the sound of footsteps ceased entirely, leaving me with the usual forest noises, but the damage had been done. My nerves were frayed, and I lay awake, unable to stop thinking about what had moved through the trees. Morning arrived with relief. Sunlight broke through the canopy, casting dappled patterns across the clearing. I packed up cautiously, scanning the surrounding woods as I did so. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of the previous night's disturbance. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination or a nocturnal animal, but a gnawing unease remained. Still, I decided to continue the hike to the secondary campsite I had marked on my map, hoping movement would restore some sense of safety. The path to the next clearing was difficult. I had to climb over fallen logs and navigate around patches of dense undergrowth. The forest felt different now, less welcoming somehow. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the wind, every rustle of leaves. My mind conjured explanations, but it didn't calm me. I reached the second site by late afternoon. This clearing was larger, flatter, with a small pond nearby. It seemed safer, more open. I set up the tent again, made another fire, and tried to relax. But the feeling from the previous night lingered. Every crackle in the fire, every gust of wind through the trees, set my nerves on edge. I kept checking the perimeter, moving slowly, deliberately, always scanning. That night, the noises returned. Crunching, snapping, deliberate footsteps circling the clearing. My heart pounded. I had no weapon, no real protection. The flashlight did little more than illuminate tiny patches of the woods around me. I debated leaving immediately, hiking back to my car in the dark, but the thought of navigating the dense forest at night terrified me even more. Hours passed. The footsteps grew bolder, closer, almost brushing against the edge of the firelight. I stayed as still as possible, breathing shallowly. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I waited, tense, until the first light of dawn. When I emerged from the tent, I found something I hadn't expected. Footprints. Human footprints, large, muddy, circling the clearing. Someone had been there all night. Fear surged through me, but so did determination. I packed my gear with meticulous care, making sure nothing was left behind. Every noise, every movement kept me alert. I took the trail back the way I had come, scanning constantly. I didn't encounter anyone directly, but the forest felt hostile, oppressive, as if it knew I had been alone and vulnerable. I made it back to my car late that afternoon. The road was quiet, empty, as if no one had been there all week. I checked the vehicle thoroughly before getting in, locking the doors, starting the engine, and driving off slowly, eyes constantly scanning the treeline. The unease stayed with me, lingering for days afterward, a shadow in the back of my mind. Eventually, I reported the footprints to the Park Service. They told me that the area had seen reports of people living illegally in the woods, squatters who avoided detection and moved quietly. Nothing dangerous, they said, but the realization that someone had been watching me, circling my campsite all night, changed my perception entirely. I had not been alone. I had been exposed in ways I had never imagined. The experience changed how I approached solitude. I still camped alone, but I chose well-traveled areas, kept my phone charged and within reach, and always informed someone of my exact location. I never let my guard down again. That night in the deep woods remained a stark reminder of the vulnerability of isolation. Nature was beautiful, serene, even calming, but it was also indifferent, sometimes dangerous, and filled with unknown presences. I had survived, and in doing so, I learned a lesson I would never forget. Preparation and awareness were not just useful, they were essential. I had always enjoyed camping alone. There was a quiet comfort in the isolation, a chance to step away from everything familiar and exist only in the rhythm of nature. This time, I chose a spot deeper in the woods than I had ever gone before, a place I had read about in old forums, where the trail was rough and few people ventured. The map I had studied for weeks indicated a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick pines and scrub oaks, far enough from the nearest road to guarantee solitude. I wanted that isolation. I wanted to see if I could handle being entirely alone, depending only on myself. I arrived in the late morning. The trail had been rough, narrow in places, and littered with fallen branches and rocks. My legs were sore, my boots worn from the hike, and my backpack heavy with supplies. The weight was comforting in a strange way. It reminded me I was prepared. I had packed a small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, enough food for 3 days, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and some basic tools. I had considered bringing a small knife as well, though I tried not to think too much about why exactly I felt the need for it. The clearing was smaller than I had imagined, but perfect for my purpose. The ground was slightly uneven, scattered with pine needles and fallen leaves. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating shifting patterns that moved with the wind. I set up the tent, making sure to position it so that the opening faced the creek. Water was a necessity, and having it visible from my shelter offered some reassurance. By the time I had finished, the sun was past its peak, but there was enough light to gather firewood and prepare for the evening. As I collected wood, I noticed that the forest was unusually quiet. There were the standard sounds, birds chirping, the occasional rustle of small animals, but no larger noises. No distant traffic, no airplanes, no human voices. Just the wind in the trees and the sound of my own movements. It was a quiet I wasn't entirely comfortable with. I shrugged it off. Part of camping alone was embracing that quiet, letting it fill me rather than frighten me. The fire went up without difficulty. I stacked the wood carefully, making sure to leave room to add more if needed. As the flames caught, the smell of burning pine filled the air. I boiled some water, ate a simple meal, and cleaned up carefully, burying scraps and packing away anything that might attract wildlife. When night fell, it was almost complete darkness. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. That's when I heard it. First, I thought it was just the wind, a cracking sound, like a branch snapping. But then it came again, closer this time, deliberate, a crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze. My heart began to race, and I told myself to calm down. This was the forest. Animals moved at night. Deer, maybe a bear, though the latter was unlikely given the area. I had read that most wildlife would avoid humans, and I reassured myself of that. I unzipped the tent slightly and peered out, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light of the moon. Nothing. Just the black shapes of trees and the faint reflection of the creek. Still, the sound persisted, sometimes close, sometimes further away, but always around me. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the crunching had a rhythm now. Someone or something was moving deliberately through the woods. Panic began to creep in. I tried to focus on rational explanations. Perhaps it was a hiker, though the nearest trail was far, and few people ventured this deep. Perhaps it was an animal after all, but the deliberate movements sounded too intentional, too calculated. I grabbed my flashlight and prepared to step outside, just to get a look, but hesitation held me back. There was no need to confront something I might not be able to handle. I settled back, trying to stay quiet, listening for any indication of what might be nearby. Hours passed. Each rustle, each snap of a twig made my chest tighten. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, always interrupted by the noises outside. At some point, the sound of footsteps ceased entirely, leaving me with the usual forest noises. But the damage had been done. My nerves were frayed, and I lay awake, unable to stop thinking about what had moved through the trees. Morning arrived with relief. Sunlight broke through the canopy, casting dappled patterns across the clearing. I packed up cautiously, scanning the surrounding woods as I did so. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of the previous night's disturbance. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination or a nocturnal animal, but a gnawing unease remained. Still, I decided to continue the hike to the secondary campsite I had marked on my map, hoping movement would restore some sense of safety. I had been planning the trip for weeks, carefully mapping out a route deep into the forest that few hikers ventured into. The kind of place that appeared on no tourist maps, where the dirt roads narrowed into barely their tracks and the trees closed in so tightly that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I wanted isolation, silence, a break from the noise of cities and towns, a chance to truly be alone with the wilderness. I had my backpack packed with everything I thought I might need. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag rated for cold nights, food, water, fire-starting materials, a first aid kit, and some extra gear for emergencies. I told myself I was ready for anything. The drive out of the city had been long but uneventful, the miles stretching on as the concrete gave way to asphalt, and asphalt gave way to gravel. By the time I reached the last stretch of rough dirt road, it was mid-afternoon, the sun high but beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. I parked my car in a small clearing at the edge of the forest, the only sign of human presence a faint, worn trailhead that disappeared quickly into the trees. I checked my pack one last time, tightened the straps, and stepped onto the trail, feeling the weight of both my gear and my decision to leave civilization behind. The forest immediately swallowed me. The trees were tall and thick, ancient in appearance, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into faint, greenish shadows. The air was cooler here, heavier, carrying the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the occasional dog barking voices were gone, replaced with the constant rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk, and the low hum of insects. Each step I took on the uneven trail felt deliberate. The ground was soft in some places, slippery with moss, littered with twigs and roots that threatened to trip me. By the time I had walked for about an hour, I found a spot that seemed suitable for camping. A small clearing opened between the trees, with enough flat ground to set up my tent, and a shallow creek trickled nearby. I set down my backpack, unrolled my sleeping bag, and began to assemble the tent. The work was methodical, almost meditative. I staked the corners into the soft soil, raised the poles, and secured the rainfly. Once the tent was up, I gathered wood for a fire, careful to select dry pieces that would catch easily. I built a small fire pit from stones and arranged kindling inside, struck a match, and watched as the flames slowly grew, crackling and sending off a faint smoke that mingled with the forest scent. As the day faded, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched long and thin, flickering in the firelight, and the air grew colder. The creek murmured beside me, louder now that the forest was quieter. Birds that had been singing all afternoon had gone silent, and the usual insect chorus seemed less steady, more erratic. I ate a simple dinner of dried meat and bread, washed it down with water from my bottle, and sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the quiet and the warmth. The sense of solitude was exhilarating at first, but as darkness deepened, a creeping unease began to settle in. Around midnight, I had long since extinguished the fire and was lying in my sleeping bag inside the tent. The forest around me had become a strange, alien place. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The snap of a branch in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the occasional thump against a tree. My imagination tried to play tricks on me, filling these ordinary sounds with menace. I reminded myself that animals lived here, that the forest was full of life, and most of it was harmless. But still, I felt a shiver run through me, my mind alert to every small movement. It was then that I first noticed the sound of footsteps. Soft at first, careful, deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. They were outside the tent, moving slowly among the trees. My heart rate quickened, and I reminded myself that there was no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour. The nearest road was miles away, and few people ventured into this part of the forest at night. I considered the possibility that I was hearing the movements of a deer or another large animal, but something about the rhythm was wrong, too precise, too intentional. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, there was silence, broken only by the faint babble of the creek. Then the footsteps continued, circling around my campsite. Panic began to rise. I had a small flashlight in my tent, a survival knife, and a whistle, but I had never imagined I would need to defend myself against another human in the middle of the forest. I listened, trying to convince myself it was a raccoon, a bear, or some other animal, but the steady pacing, the weight of the steps, told a different story. Whoever it was knew I was here. They were testing, searching, waiting. I sat perfectly still, my breathing shallow, eyes wide, trying to determine my next move. I considered stepping outside to confront the person, but I knew that would be foolish. The forest gave them cover, and I had no advantage. I thought about fleeing, running along the trail back to the car, but I realized that the darkness, the uneven ground, and my unfamiliarity with the path would make me an easy target if they decided to pursue me. The safest thing, it seemed, was to wait, to stay hidden, and hope that whoever it was would leave. The footsteps eventually moved away, fading into the distance. I waited, tense, until I could no longer hear them. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting inside my tent, knife in hand, flashlight at the ready, heart hammering, listening to the forest that now felt alive in a way that was almost suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every distant animal call, felt like a signal, a warning, a potential threat. I did not sleep. Morning brought light and a fragile sense of relief. The sun rose through the trees, the shadows retreating, and the forest appeared calm, almost peaceful again. I cautiously exited the tent, scanning the surrounding area. There were no signs of anyone else, no footprints beyond the ones left by animals, no broken branches indicating someone had passed through. I packed up my campsite quickly, not wanting to linger, and started back along the trail toward my car. It was then that I realized the extent of the danger. The trail, which I had assumed would be clear and straightforward, had been disturbed. Rocks that I remembered were on the path had been moved. Small branches were snapped in ways that suggested they had been stepped on deliberately. My unease grew with every step. I increased my pace, glancing behind me frequently, my backpack heavy, my senses heightened. I could feel the sweat running down my back, not just from exertion, but from fear. By midday, I had covered several miles, and the trail seemed to stretch endlessly. The forest remained quiet, too quiet, as though it were holding its breath. I reminded myself to stay calm, to keep walking, to avoid panic. Hunger and thirst were beginning to press on me, but I ignored them, focusing only on reaching my car. The sun was high overhead now, and the forest no longer offered the same dark cover it had at night. I took comfort in the visibility, in the thought that any person approaching would be exposed just as I was. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail. My map indicated that both paths would eventually lead back to the road, but one was longer and more isolated. I chose the more direct route, hoping to escape the forest as quickly as possible. It was slow going. Roots and rocks threatened to trip me at every step, and the undergrowth was thick, scratching at my legs and arms. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue began to set in. My pace slowed, and I became increasingly aware of how alone I truly was. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a deer or a large bird, but as I focused, I realized it was a person. They were walking along the trail, moving in my direction. My heart stopped. I ducked behind a tree, holding my breath, trying to remain unseen. The person stopped for a moment, scanning the area, then continued. They were carrying a large backpack, dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. They passed within a few feet of where I was hiding, oblivious to my presence. Once they were gone, I exhaled slowly, realizing that I had narrowly avoided another encounter. I continued along the trail, increasingly desperate to reach the road. The forest seemed endless, stretching on, unyielding, each step heavier than the last. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin, and the sound of the road ahead became faintly audible. Relief surged through me, though I remained cautious, scanning every movement, every shadow. Eventually, the trail opened into a clearing, and there it was. My car, parked exactly where I had left it, as if nothing had happened. I rushed to it, unlocked the doors, and climbed inside. I sat there for a long moment, breathing heavily, heart still racing, and then started the engine. The sound of the motor was deafening in my ears, a reminder of civilization, of safety. I drove away from the forest slowly at first, then faster as the road straightened and widened, until the trees thinned and the familiar signs of towns and people reappeared. By the time I reached the nearest gas station, the sun had set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red. I stopped, refueled, and took a long drink of water, feeling the tension leave my body in small increments. I called someone to let them know I was safe, my hands still trembling slightly. It was over. The forest had tested me, shown me a version of isolation and fear I had never experienced, and I had survived. The experience left a mark. I never returned to that forest, and I became hyper-aware of the risks involved in remote hiking and camping. I invested in better gear, learned advanced survival skills, and always let someone know exactly where I would be. The memory of those footsteps at night, the sense of being watched, the dread of the unknown, stayed with me for years. But it also taught me something vital. Preparation, awareness, and calm thinking could save a life when isolation and danger intersect. I walked into that forest seeking solitude and adventure, and I walked out with a new respect for both the wilderness and the fragility of human safety within it. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks, meticulously choosing the spot, checking the weather, and packing all the gear I thought I would need. I wanted a place that felt isolated but not dangerous, somewhere deep in the woods but with access to a trail I could follow. I had done this before, but this time I decided to push a little further into the forest than I normally would. The area I chose was known for its dense woods, a small creek, and a couple of steep ridges that promised some good hiking views. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly nature could turn from serene to threatening. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. My backpack was heavy, filled with the usual camping gear: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, and an emergency whistle. I had a small folding shovel, a rope, and a few extra layers of clothing in case the temperature dropped. I had even packed some extra food, just in case. I wanted to be ready for anything, though I didn't realize how much anything could expand to. The trail was narrow at first, lined with birch and pine trees. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, muffling my footsteps. At first, the hike was peaceful. Birds called to each other, and a light breeze moved the branches above me, making patterns of light and shadow that danced across the ground. I found myself relaxing, enjoying the quiet, thinking about how nice it would be to have a fire tonight, cook some simple food, and just lie back and look at the stars. After a couple of miles, the trail became steeper. Rocks and roots jutted out, forcing me to watch my step carefully. The forest grew denser, the sunlight dimming as the tall trees closed in. I noticed the sound of the creek in the distance, a gentle gurgling that promised water and a scenic campsite nearby. I pushed myself a little harder, eager to reach a spot before dark. By the time I found the creek, the sun had almost disappeared. I scouted a small clearing near the water, level enough to pitch my tent. The ground was damp but not soggy, and I could see signs that animals occasionally passed through. I unpacked my gear, pitching the tent carefully, making sure it was secure. I gathered firewood nearby, dry sticks and small logs, though I could hear the distant crackle of the creek soaking the larger logs. Setting up the fire pit took some work, clearing stones and making sure it was a safe distance from the tent. Once the fire was lit, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and instant rice, eating slowly while listening to the night settle around me. The temperature dropped quickly, and I layered on my jacket, feeling the cold settle into my bones. As darkness deepened, the sounds of the forest became more pronounced. The wind rustled through the leaves, distant owls called, and small animals moved in the underbrush. It was peaceful, but a part of me was aware of the isolation. I was completely alone, and I had no cell service. That thought made my stomach tighten slightly, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I slept lightly that night, waking several times to the sounds outside. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made me tense. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the firelight. I held my breath, straining my eyes, but nothing emerged from the shadows. By morning, the forest seemed less threatening. The light of the rising sun warmed my back, and the sound of the creek was cheerful again. I packed up slowly, careful to leave the area as clean as I had found it. The first part of the hike that morning was easy. I followed the trail along the creek, occasionally stopping to take water from the stream. I noticed bear scat near the trail, reminding me that wild animals shared this forest. I moved quietly, making sure not to startle anything. My goal was to reach a ridge that promised a good view before the day ended. By midday, the terrain became rougher. The trail disappeared under fallen leaves and loose rocks. I had to use my hands to steady myself on steep inclines. At one point, I misjudged a step and slipped, scraping my leg against a jagged rock. The pain was sharp, but I was able to stand. I cleaned the wound with water from my bottle, pressing a cloth against it to stop the bleeding. That small injury made me more cautious, every step deliberate, but also aware that the forest didn't forgive mistakes easily. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I had misjudged the distance. What I thought would take a couple of hours was stretching into most of the day. I began to feel the first twinges of exhaustion. My backpack felt heavier, my legs burned, and the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees. The forest grew quieter, almost too quiet. Birds stopped calling, and the usual scurrying of animals faded. I kept telling myself it was normal for animals to retreat at this hour, but my instincts were on edge. I found a small plateau near the edge of the ridge just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The view was breathtaking, but I realized I had underestimated the difficulty of returning before nightfall. My legs ached and my energy was low. I decided to set up a temporary camp here, using my emergency tarp since pitching a full tent on the rocky ground would be difficult. I cleared a small area, spread the tarp, and dug a shallow depression for water runoff in case it rained. I set my pack nearby, keeping my fire starter close. Night fell faster than I expected. I had a small flashlight, but I wanted to conserve the batteries. I built a tiny fire from sticks I had carried from the creek earlier. The light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the rocky plateau. The temperature dropped sharply, and I huddled against my jacket, trying to stay warm. Hunger gnawed at me, but I only had a small snack left. I rationed it carefully, knowing I might need it until morning. Around midnight, I heard the first unusual sound. It was a low, grinding noise, like rocks shifting, coming from somewhere in the trees below the ridge. I froze, listening. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear, but the sound continued, deliberate and slow. Then I heard movement above the ridge, small crunches on the dry leaves. My heart raced. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. Every instinct told me to move, but I was trapped on this rocky plateau, with no clear path down in the dark. The sounds continued intermittently. Sometimes they were close, sometimes distant, but always moving around me. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch, the shuffle of leaves, the soft scrape of something heavy. My mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a large animal looking for food, maybe another hiker, maybe nothing at all. But the tension was unbearable. Every rustle made me jump. Every shadow looked alive. I realized that staying on the plateau was dangerous. If a large animal or another person was nearby, I had no escape route. I decided to move carefully down the ridge, hugging the rocks and trees for cover. My movements were slow, deliberate, testing each foothold. The ground was slippery in places, and I had to use my hands to steady myself. My flashlight revealed jagged rocks and tree roots, forcing me to navigate carefully. As I descended, I heard the sounds following me. Not the same noises, but movement in the darkness, close enough to keep me alert. Fear pushed me forward, but exhaustion slowed me. At one point, I stumbled and fell hard, sliding a few feet down a moss-covered rock. My hands were cut and bleeding, my backpack scratched and torn, but I managed to stop myself from sliding further. I lay there for a moment, catching my breath, feeling the cold stone beneath me. The sounds were still there, but slightly farther away. Eventually, I reached a small clearing lower down. I could see the faint glow of my firelight from earlier, now reduced to embers, behind me. I stopped, listening. The forest was silent, except for the occasional creak in the distance. Relief washed over me. I realized I had escaped whatever had been near the plateau. I rested for a while, letting my pulse slow, examining my wounds. The cuts on my hands and leg were not severe, but they stung. I applied a makeshift bandage with some cloth from my backpack, cleaning the blood with water. At first light, I began the final stretch back to the main trail. The forest looked completely different in the daylight, familiar and safe. I kept moving, focusing on each step, each foot placement. By midday, I emerged from the dense woods onto the main trail. Relief and exhaustion hit me at the same time. I was bruised, scratched, and tired, but I was safe. I made my way to the parking lot slowly, taking breaks to rest my legs. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, breathing hard, my hands shaking. The drive back was long and quiet. I replayed every moment in my mind, every noise, every movement, every shadow. I realized how lucky I had been, how close I had come to serious injury or worse. I promised myself I would respect the forest more, prepare better, and never underestimate how quickly a peaceful place could become dangerous. That night, back home, I cleaned my wounds thoroughly and bandaged them properly. I wrote down everything I remembered from the trip, trying to capture the details while they were fresh. I understood now that fear in the wild is real, grounded in logic, in the uncertainty of the environment, in the raw challenge of surviving when things go wrong. I didn't need ghosts or monsters. Nature itself had provided enough terror to make me rethink every camping trip I would take in the future. I kept the experience in my mind, sometimes replaying it in detail, not with regret, but as a lesson. I realized that preparation, awareness, and respect for the wilderness were what made camping enjoyable, and what kept me alive. From that point on, I never camped alone without letting someone know my route, my expected return, and carrying multiple forms of emergency gear. The forest hadn't changed, but I had, and that knowledge, hard-earned and visceral, made all the difference. I had planned the trip for weeks, The area I chose was remote, deep in the forested mountains where the trails were rough and few people ventured. The idea of solitude and isolation had appealed to me. I wanted to disconnect, to feel the wilderness around me without the constant hum of civilization. I had packed thoroughly. A large tent, sleeping bag rated for cold weather, extra layers, a sturdy backpack, a portable stove, ample food and water, first aid supplies, a flashlight, a headlamp, and plenty of batteries. I had studied the trail maps and topography, noting water sources, elevation changes, and potential campsites along the way. I was confident, experienced enough in hiking and camping to manage a solo trip safely. I started early in the morning, the forest still cool and heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. The trailhead was quiet. My only company was the occasional bird or rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The first few hours were uneventful, the trail winding upward with a gentle incline. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in patches, casting shadows that shifted slowly as the day progressed. I kept my pace steady, stopping occasionally to rest and sip water, taking photographs of the landscape, trying to remember every detail. By mid-afternoon, the terrain began to change. The forest became denser, the trees older and more twisted. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks protruding at sharp angles. The trail markers were farther apart, and in some places, I had to pause and make sure I hadn't missed a turn. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The wind that once moved lightly through the trees was replaced by stillness. There was no birdsong, no insect chatter. Even the usual rustling of squirrels seemed absent. An uneasy feeling started to creep into my mind, but I shrugged it off. I told myself that wilderness could be quiet, especially as the sun began to drop toward the horizon. I found a small clearing around 5 in the afternoon, flat enough to set up camp. There was a shallow depression in the earth, ideal for pitching my tent. I began unpacking, carefully staking the tent, rolling out my sleeping pad, and organizing my gear. I collected firewood from fallen branches, dry but not brittle. By the time I finished, the sun was low, and shadows stretched long across the clearing. The forest around me was dense and dark, the trees looming like silent watchers. I started a small fire in the fire pit I had dug, the smell of burning wood filling the clearing. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and sat back to eat, the quiet of the forest pressing in around me. Night came faster than I expected. The sky turned from orange to deep blue, and finally to black, with stars faintly visible through breaks in the canopy. The fire crackled, a thin ribbon of smoke rising and twisting toward the treetops. The temperature dropped sharply, and I zipped myself into my sleeping bag after a quick wash at the small stream nearby. I left my flashlight and phone within reach, fully aware that my cell signal was weak and unreliable. The first night was surprisingly restless. Every snap of a twig, every distant rustle made me tense. My imagination started to fill the darkness with shadows and movement. I reminded myself repeatedly that I was alone, that everything I could hear was likely an animal, a branch falling, or my own mind playing tricks. Around midnight, I woke to a different sound. It wasn't the usual night noises. It was deliberate, slow, and close. At first, I thought it was an animal dragging itself across the forest floor, perhaps a deer or a bear. I froze, listening. The noise repeated, softer now, but steady. Something was moving just outside my tent. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, straining to see through the thin fabric. The moonlight was faint, barely illuminating the clearing, but I could make out shapes, dark shapes moving slowly among the trees. My heart raced. I had packed bear spray, and I kept it next to me. I told myself to stay calm, that most wildlife would avoid humans, but the sound was so close it made my stomach tighten. I waited for what felt like hours. Eventually, the noises stopped, replaced by silence. A silence so deep that I could hear my own breathing and the crackling of the dying fire. Sleep eluded me, my mind running through every possible scenario. The forest, so inviting in the day, now felt hostile, alive with things I couldn't see. I spent the night awake, barely moving, listening for any sound, ready to grab my gear at the first sign of danger. The next morning, I was exhausted. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that no real harm had come to me. I ate sparingly, rationing my water, and packed up the tent quickly. The trail ahead was steep and rocky, and I knew I had to move carefully. By mid-morning, I had made some distance along the trail. I tried to focus on the beauty of the forest, on the sunlight filtering through the trees, on the quiet streams that cut through the undergrowth. But the memory of the previous night's noises lingered, a constant edge to my attention. Around noon, I came to a narrow section of the trail with a steep drop on one side. The path was loose gravel and dirt, with a sheer wall of rock on the other side. I moved slowly, testing each step, using my trekking poles for stability. Halfway through, I heard it again, a sound of breaking branches, but this time it was coming from below the cliff. I froze, listening. Something large was moving through the underbrush, climbing upward. It wasn't a bear. The movement was deliberate, quick, and the sound of it breaking through brush was different, heavier. My mind raced. I had heard reports of people getting lost, of hikers being attacked, but I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was just another animal, maybe it was something else entirely. I moved faster, but cautiously. Every step felt precarious. The sound followed, always just behind. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I considered turning back, but the trail was narrow, and turning around was risky. I kept moving, careful not to make sudden noises. After what felt like an hour, the path opened into a wider area with a small stream. I slowed, crouching behind a boulder to catch my breath. I could see no one, hear no movement, but I felt eyes on me, the hair on my neck standing up. I decided then to leave the trail and move parallel to it, finding a path through denser brush where I could avoid being seen or followed. Hours passed. The forest grew thicker, the terrain more difficult. I stumbled, scraped my hands on rocks, and slipped into mud. I realized I had no idea exactly where I was, only that I needed to keep moving toward lower ground. I remembered my maps and compass, and I used them to orient myself. Eventually, I found a small clearing near another stream, flat enough to rest. I drank sparingly, ate a small snack, and tried to calm myself. I knew I couldn't stay long. If whoever or whatever had been following me was still nearby, staying in one place was dangerous. That night was worse than the first. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves felt like movement toward me. I kept my fire low, just enough to see my immediate surroundings. I lay in my sleeping bag, rigid with fear, barely closing my eyes. I kept my backpack close, bear spray and knife within reach. The hours crawled by. I dozed in tiny increments, waking every few minutes. At some point, the fire died completely, and I had to relight it in near total darkness. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the lighter. I realized that fear could be as dangerous as any predator out here. Morning came and I had to move. My body ached, and my mind was frayed. I followed the stream downhill, hoping it would lead to a larger river or a trail. Hours passed with little change, and my water was nearly gone. I knew I needed to find people soon. My heart sank as I realized how deep in the forest I truly was. Every tree looked the same. Every bend of the stream seemed familiar and disorienting. Around late afternoon, I finally heard a faint sound of human activity. Voices, distant but real, and the sound of machinery, chainsaws or vehicles. I followed the sound, pushing through thick brush and fallen trees. My legs were exhausted, and my hands were raw, but the hope of finding people gave me strength. Eventually, I stumbled into a logging road, where a truck stopped for me. The workers were surprised to see someone in such rough shape, dehydrated, scratched, and clearly terrified. They gave me water, food, and a radio to call for help. I stayed with them until the authorities arrived, guiding them back along the logging roads to a safer trailhead. In the aftermath, I realized how close I had come to real danger. It wasn't a supernatural presence or some fairy tale creature. It was isolation, exhaustion, and the natural hazards of the forest, the uneven terrain, the potential for wild animals, and the sheer remoteness. The fear I felt was real, primal, but it was survival instinct, sharpened to its edge by my circumstances. I returned home with a new respect for the wilderness. I still camp, still hike, but my approach is different now. I prepare more carefully, avoid remote areas alone, and understand that nature doesn't need to be haunted to be terrifying. It's enough that it's vast, unpredictable, and indifferent to humans. That realization, though frightening at the time, gave me clarity and a deeper appreciation for the world beyond roads and buildings. Survival depended on attention, preparation, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. It wasn't luck, it was focus, endurance, and respect for the environment. Even now, months later, I can remember that night vividly. The silence, the shadows moving just beyond the firelight, the creeping dread of not knowing what was out there. But I also remember the relief of finding the road, the human voices, and the understanding that I had made it through entirely on my own, relying on my skills, my observation, and my determination. That clarity stays with me, a reminder that fear can sharpen the mind, but preparation and patience can see you through even the darkest, most uncertain moments in the wilderness. I had planned this camping trip for months. I had been spending a lot of time in the city, working long hours, surrounded by noise, and constantly under stress. I felt I needed to escape completely, to disconnect, to breathe the kind of air that didn't smell of exhaust or food trucks, the air that smelled of pine and wet earth, the kind of quiet that made you feel small and, at the same time, free. I chose a remote forest area, far from towns, far from roads. The map showed a large section of dense forest with a river running through it, some marked trails, and a few spots that seemed promising for a campsite. I packed my gear carefully, leaving nothing unnecessary, but I made sure I had everything I could need to survive on my own. A tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a pocket knife, a map, a compass, and fire-starting tools. I also had a small stove and a kettle, even though I wanted to rely mostly on campfires for cooking. I wanted to make sure I was prepared for anything because the place I was going to was isolated, and I didn't want to make mistakes that could cost me. The first day was uneventful. I started early in the morning, hiking into the forest with my backpack. The air was crisp and cold, a light breeze moving through the treetops. The sun filtered through the leaves in thin, golden lines. Birds called to each other in the distance. I walked for hours, following the map and marking my path, making sure I wouldn't get lost. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to step over fallen logs, push aside thick brush, and carefully navigate small streams. I kept my pace steady, conscious that I had to save my energy for when I would actually set up camp. Around mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing near the river, a spot that was high enough to be safe if it rained, and sheltered by tall pines and oaks. I unpacked my gear, set up my tent carefully, and started a small fire. I cooked some food, ate slowly, and watched the light fade through the trees. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves or distant bird calls. Everything felt peaceful. I felt safe. I felt ready. That night, the forest changed. It was subtle at first. The wind shifted, and the sound of leaves brushing together became louder. A low, almost constant rustling echoed from the underbrush, and I realized that I could hear more than I had during the day. I tried to convince myself that it was just animals moving around, that I was overthinking it. But I could feel a tension building in the air, a certain heaviness. The shadows around my campsite grew longer, darker. Every small noise made me tense. A branch snapping made me jump, my hand reaching instinctively for my knife. I stayed by the fire, keeping it alive longer than necessary, and eventually the sounds faded into the background as I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, feeling more alert than usual. Something about being alone in that forest made every sense sharper. The smell of wet soil, moss, and pine needles was stronger than I remembered from the previous day. Birds were noisier, and I noticed a few small animals moving through the underbrush. Squirrels, rabbits, a fox. I wanted to explore more before nightfall, so I packed my gear, keeping my tent standing in case I needed to return. I hiked deeper into the forest, following a small trail that ran parallel to the river. The trail was narrow and difficult, but I was confident I could handle it. I kept checking my compass and map, making sure I was moving in the right direction. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange. The forest seemed quieter than usual. Even the river, which had been loud and lively, sounded distant now. The sunlight that had been streaming through the trees now appeared patchy, as if the canopy had thickened. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was nothing. But then I realized I had not seen another person all day. No hikers, no campers, no signs of human activity. The trail I was following seemed less maintained, more natural, and I began to notice signs that someone had been there before me. Not old signs, but recent ones. Small bits of trash, footprints partially washed by the river, a cut branch left behind. The thought made my stomach tighten. I was alone in a remote part of the forest, and someone else had been here. I didn't know if they were still nearby, but the possibility made me cautious. I slowed my pace, paying attention to every sound, every movement. Then I saw the first sign that truly frightened me. A tree not far from the trail had a series of marks on its bark, deep and deliberate, almost like scratches made by claws, but too big for any animal I knew. I stepped closer to inspect, keeping my hand on my knife, and realized that there were small pieces of fabric caught in the bark. They looked like remnants of clothing. I froze. My mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be dangerous. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was from an accident, or someone had simply gotten caught in the tree. But the instinctive fear was there, and I couldn't ignore it. I decided to turn back toward my campsite before nightfall, wanting to put distance between myself and whatever had been there. On the way back, the forest became even more oppressive. The sun started to set behind thick clouds, the light dimming quickly. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and moving leaves across the forest floor in waves. I kept my eyes on the trail, but it was easy to lose the path in the growing darkness. I reached my campsite, but something was wrong. My tent flap was partially open, and the fire I had left burning low had gone out. I hadn't left it unattended for long, maybe an hour at most. The first thought that struck me was that someone had been there. Someone had seen me and approached while I was away. I felt a cold sweat on my back, and I immediately checked my gear. My food and stove were untouched. Nothing seemed to have been stolen, but the tent flap being open was enough to make my heart race. I quickly rebuilt the fire, piling on as much wood as I could. I checked the perimeter, looking for any signs of footprints or disturbances, but the ground was soft from recent rain, and any tracks were hard to read. Still, my instincts screamed at me that I was not alone. I decided not to sleep in the tent that night. I moved my sleeping bag and some supplies under a thick pine overhang, a makeshift shelter, with the fire in front of me for light and warmth. I stayed awake most of the night, listening to the forest, tense with every sound. The rustle of small animals, the crack of branches under weight, the occasional bird cry. Hours passed. Nothing approached. The hours stretched into a long, anxious night. I survived by keeping calm and staying alert, knowing that panic would only make me careless. The next morning, I decided to break camp early. I didn't want to risk spending another night in that spot. I packed everything carefully, making sure nothing was left behind. As I walked along the trail, I noticed more signs that someone had been around recently. Footprints in the mud, cut branches forming crude markers, small pieces of trash. I tried to avoid them, but it was impossible to ignore the pattern. Whoever had been here had moved through the forest like I had, leaving subtle signs. I realized they were likely watching the area, moving quietly, avoiding detection. I was not dealing with an accident or a lost hiker. This was deliberate. The thought filled me with a raw, primitive fear. I decided to head toward the river, following it downstream. Water often led to people or towns, and I hoped that by moving along the river I could find an exit from this isolated forest. The river was wider than I expected, with rocks and small rapids. The path was rough, slippery in places, and I had to be careful not to injure myself. Every sound in the forest now seemed amplified. Birds, rustling leaves, branches snapping. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. I tried to focus on the river, on keeping my footing, on moving forward. Hunger and fatigue were starting to set in, but I ignored them. My goal was to get out safely, not to enjoy the scenery. By mid-afternoon, I spotted a small clearing along the riverbank. It looked like a good spot to rest briefly. I set down my pack, drank water, and ate a small portion of my food. While resting, I noticed more signs of someone having passed through here. Footprints near the water, bits of torn paper caught on branches, small rock piles. It became clear to me that the person was following the river as well. I felt panic creeping back, but I forced myself to stay calm. I decided to move as quickly as I could without exhausting myself, keeping a mental note of every landmark so I could navigate back if needed. I kept my knife within reach, my eyes scanning the forest constantly. Hours later, the forest began to thin. I could see taller trees giving way to open areas, and I started to hear distant sounds of traffic and human activity. My pace quickened. I kept moving, careful not to make too much noise, careful not to stumble or draw attention. Eventually, the forest opened onto a dirt road, and I recognized the sound of vehicles. Relief washed over me. I followed the road until I came across a small ranger station. The people there were surprised to see someone emerge from the deep forest, looking exhausted and covered in dirt. I explained my situation, and they immediately called authorities to report the signs I had seen. The marks, the footprints, the evidence of someone moving deliberately through the forest. They arranged transport for me, and I finally left the area safely. In the weeks that followed, I learned more about what had happened. The authorities investigated the forest area and found evidence of someone living in the woods, following trails, and observing campers. They confirmed that I had unknowingly come into contact with a person who was skilled at moving unnoticed, someone who had been in that forest for months. No one was injured, and my preparedness, caution, and instincts had kept me safe. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me the value of awareness, preparation, and staying calm in situations where fear could easily overwhelm. I had gone into the forest seeking peace, but I had found something else entirely. The raw, realistic danger of being truly alone, unprepared, and exposed to forces I could not control. I survived because I respected the wilderness, but also because I respected the unpredictable nature of human beings. I never camped alone in such remote areas again, and I carried that lesson with me for the rest of my life. The forest remained beautiful and silent when I thought of it, but now I also remembered the tension, the fear, and the sharp focus that had saved me from harm. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. It wasn't a particularly exotic location, just a stretch of forested hills several hours from the nearest town, but I liked the isolation it offered. My goal was simple: spend a few nights alone, away from any distractions, just me, my gear, and the woods. I told myself I wanted peace, a chance to reset my mind, and maybe get some good hiking in. I wasn't naive about the risks. I knew about wild animals, weather changes, and getting lost. I had packed carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water, a first aid kit, a compass, a map, and a reliable flashlight. I had also studied the terrain for weeks, making notes about water sources, trails, and elevations. The drive to the trailhead was long and quiet. The road narrowed and wound through the hills until it became a rough dirt path barely wide enough for a single car. My car shook over potholes and loose gravel, and by the time I parked, my stomach was tight with anticipation. I shouldered my backpack, heavy with supplies, and took my first steps on the trail. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. Birds chirped overhead, and every so often a squirrel or rabbit darted across my path. At first, the hike was straightforward. The trail rose gradually, the canopy providing a patchwork of sunlight and shadow. I kept an even pace, stopping occasionally to drink water or check my map. Around midday, I reached a small clearing by a stream, a place I had marked as a potential campsite if I didn't want to go further. I paused to rest, crouched by the water, splashing my face with cool liquid. Felt invigorating. I ate some trail mix and observed the surroundings. The clearing was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The only sounds were the trickle of water and distant bird calls. After a short rest, I decided to press on. My plan was to reach a larger clearing higher up, one that overlooked the valley below. The hike became steeper and more strenuous, the path narrower and more overgrown. Roots twisted underfoot, and rocks jutted out of the soil, making every step a careful calculation. By late afternoon, I had reached the intended site. The clearing was wide enough for my tent, surrounded by a mix of tall pines and scattered birch trees. From this spot, I could see the rolling hills in the distance, the setting sun casting long orange streaks across the landscape. I felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. I began setting up my tent, securing it carefully against the uneven ground. The process took longer than I expected. The tent poles were awkward, and the ground was rocky in places. I finally managed to get it upright, then laid out my sleeping bag inside. As dusk approached, I started gathering firewood. I knew the forest could be cold at night, and the fire would also serve as a deterrent against any curious wildlife. I collected dry branches, twigs, and some larger logs, arranging them into a stack near the fire pit I dug. Night fell quickly. The air grew colder than I anticipated, and the forest became a dense, almost suffocating darkness. I lit the fire, its flames flickering and casting dancing shadows across the trees. I ate a simple meal of canned beans warmed over the fire and drank some water. As I cleaned up, I felt a strange sense of being watched. It wasn't anything tangible. No movement, no sounds beyond the usual forest noises, but a prickling at the back of my neck made me check the surrounding trees more than once. I told myself it was just my imagination, nerves amplified by isolation. I climbed into my sleeping bag as the fire dwindled to glowing embers. I kept the flashlight within reach and the knife strapped to my belt. Sleep didn't come easily. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. The forest, once calm and inviting, now felt oppressive and vast, full of unseen eyes. Around midnight, I thought I heard something. Footsteps, not like a deer hopping or a small animal scurrying, but heavier, deliberate steps, crunching on twigs in a rhythm. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight and shone it in every direction. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. I strained my ears. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. Eventually, I told myself I had imagined it and drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke suddenly to the sound of branches snapping. My heart raced. The fire had gone out, leaving me in near total darkness except for the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. The sound was closer this time, deliberate, crunching through dry leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around. At the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A figure, hunched slightly, moving cautiously among the trees. My first thought was a hiker, but the position and pace didn't make sense. Whoever it was, they weren't making any noise other than the crunching steps. Fear gripped me. I realized quickly that I couldn't outrun someone in the dark forest without a plan. My mind raced. The figure hadn't seen me yet. I debated whether to stay in the tent and wait or make noise to scare them off. I stayed still, hoping to remain hidden, but the fear made my movements jerky and noticeable. The figure stopped, and I could feel its gaze on me even though I couldn't see details. Time stretched painfully. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the figure turned and vanished into the forest. I didn't dare move until the sounds of footsteps completely faded. By the first light of dawn, I was exhausted and barely able to think straight. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep well, and the night's events left me hyper-aware of every sound. I packed my gear carefully, not wanting to leave anything behind, and decided to hike back down immediately. The forest that had seemed tranquil and welcoming the day before now felt threatening and unfamiliar. Every crackle of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent me into a state of panic. On the descent, I moved as quickly as I could while remaining cautious. The trail was slippery in places, and the steep terrain made it easy to lose footing. Several times, I had to stop to catch my breath and calm my shaking hands. I kept telling myself that daylight would make me safer, that other hikers might be on the trail, that the road back to civilization was close. Around mid-morning, I spotted a faint trail marker I had almost overlooked, confirming that I was on the right path. Relief washed over me, but I didn't let my guard down. The forest seemed alive with eyes and shadows, but I forced myself to focus on each step. I reached the stream where I had stopped the day before. I paused to drink and splash water on my face, letting myself relax for just a moment. The sound of the stream was calming, grounding me, reminding me that I was still in control. By early afternoon, I reached the trailhead and saw my car. I collapsed onto the hood for a moment, letting the relief and exhaustion hit me. My hands were scratched, my clothes torn in several places from branches and underbrush, but I was safe. The sense of danger was gone now that I was back in a place where help was possible, yet the adrenaline lingered. I drove home slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure from the night following me, but nothing appeared. The highway, the familiar signs, and other cars passing by were almost surreal after the tension and fear of the forest. I thought about the night repeatedly, analyzing every sound, every shadow, every decision I had made. Back home, I carefully unpacked my gear, inspecting it for damage. My tent was scratched and torn in a few places. The sleeping bag smelled faintly of damp and smoke. My knife had some nicks from cutting branches in the dark, and the food I had left behind was scattered in a few areas where small animals had gotten into it. I cleaned everything meticulously, labeling it as a reminder that the wilderness, no matter how beautiful, was unpredictable. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on the trip constantly. I realized I had survived not because of luck alone, but because of preparation, careful observation, and remaining calm under pressure despite fear. I never returned to that particular clearing. Instead, I chose other sites closer to trails and less isolated, respecting the fact that some areas, no matter how beautiful, carried risks that could escalate in ways I wasn't prepared for. That trip changed the way I approached the wilderness. I learned to respect the unpredictability of nature, to anticipate human threats as much as animal dangers, and to always maintain a level of vigilance, even when the environment seemed peaceful. I carried that lesson into every outdoor adventure afterward. I still camped, still sought solitude, but never without careful planning, mental preparation, and an awareness that danger could come in forms as subtle as a shadow, a sound, or a presence in the dark. Most importantly, I learned that fear is not a sign of weakness, it is a tool. It sharpens awareness, focuses attention, and keeps you alive. The memory of that night stayed with me, vivid and unsettling, but I could face it and understand it. It was a reminder that the forest is not forgiving, that isolation amplifies danger, and that survival is as much about mental endurance as physical capability. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I had mapped out a route deep in the forest, far from any roads or settlements, where few people ventured. I wanted solitude, the kind of silence you don't get even in a quiet town. I wanted the rawness of the wilderness, the kind of isolation that made you feel small and fragile. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, water, fire-starting materials, a good flashlight, extra batteries, a compass, and a knife. I double-checked everything the night before I left. I wanted this trip to be perfect, safe, and unforgettable. But in the end, nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. I drove to the trailhead early in the morning, arriving just as the sun began to rise. The parking area was empty except for a single old truck, its paint faded and rusted along the edges. I didn't see anyone around, and I was relieved. I wanted to start my hike alone. The trail began narrow and winding, cutting through tall pines that smelled faintly of sap and moss. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and my boots made muffled crunching sounds. The air was crisp, cooler than I expected for early summer, and it carried the distant sound of birds and something else. Wind whistling through branches, or maybe the movement of a deer far off. I welcomed the solitude. I had done plenty of hiking before, but nothing this deep into the forest. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail climbed steadily, winding through rocky outcrops and moss-covered logs. I stopped occasionally to take pictures or drink water to rest my legs. The forest was beautiful, silent in its own way, the kind of quiet that feels alive. Around midday, I reached a small stream. The water was clear, flowing over smooth stones, and I refilled my water bottle. I ate a granola bar and rested on a flat rock beside the stream. Everything felt perfect. I felt alive, the way I only felt when I was completely surrounded by nature. After resting, I decided to leave the main trail. I had brought a small map and compass, and I thought I could find a good spot to camp deeper in the forest, away from any other hikers. I wanted a clearing with a flat surface, some firewood nearby, and preferably close to water. The map suggested a small meadow about 2 miles east of my location. I set off, confident in my ability to navigate. First, it was easy. I followed the compass, moving between trees, keeping the stream to my left. But soon, the terrain changed. The ground became uneven, with thick underbrush and fallen branches that snagged my boots. The sun dropped lower in the sky, and the forest grew darker and colder. Shadows lengthened, and the air carried the faint, eerie sound of something moving in the distance. A rustle, a snap, a thump. I tried to tell myself it was just animals. Deer, raccoons, squirrels. I had heard these sounds countless times on previous hikes, but this felt different, heavier, closer. I pressed on, finally finding a small clearing just as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the trees. It wasn't perfect. There were rocks scattered around and a few uneven patches, but it was flat enough to set up my tent. I unpacked quickly, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had begun to settle in my chest. I collected firewood, gathering dry branches and twigs, and started a small fire. The flames crackled and gave off warmth, which comforted me. The forest, now in near total darkness, felt enormous, almost infinite. My flashlight beam cut a small path through the blackness, but beyond that, the trees loomed like silent, observing walls. As I sat by the fire eating my simple dinner of canned beans and bread, I started hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized the sounds were rhythmic, deliberate. Crunching, branches snapping under some weight. Not close, but not far either, maybe 50 yards, maybe 100. Something was moving around me. I froze, heart pounding, straining my ears. I remembered reading that wildlife is most active at dusk and dawn, but this was different. This was a presence that moved with intent. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the clearing. Nothing. The shadows seemed to shift just beyond its reach. My stomach twisted. I thought about hiking back to the trail, but I had no idea which direction led back safely. And with the darkness, I could get lost in minutes. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or maybe a coyote, but the rustling didn't sound like an animal foraging. It sounded like something large, moving cautiously but deliberately through the brush. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Bears, wild dogs, even humans. There had been reports of isolated hikers being attacked in this region years ago, and for the first time I realized how exposed I was. My fire was small and would not protect me. My phone had no signal. My map and compass were useless if I had to run blind through the dark forest. I decided to stay put and make as much noise as possible, banging sticks together and shouting into the dark. Maybe whatever it was would leave, but the sound only seemed to provoke it. The noises around the clearing grew bolder, moving closer in measured steps. My heart hammered, sweat dripping down my forehead, hands trembling. I thought about packing up and running, but I had no clear path. Every direction looked the same in the darkness. Trees, underbrush, shadows. And if it was a bear, running might be worse than staying put. I needed a plan. I remembered that bears and many predators tend to avoid humans if they know they are there. I added more logs to the fire, making it brighter, louder. I picked up a large branch like a club, telling myself it could be a weapon if needed. The sound of movement continued, circling the clearing now, testing, watching. I forced myself to breathe slowly, focusing on the firelight, trying not to think about how easy it would be for someone or something to grab me and disappear into the forest. Hours passed. I don't know exactly how long. The fire dwindled, and the forest seemed to press closer. Every crack of a branch, every rustle, made me flinch. My body ached from tension. My stomach knotted. At one point, I saw a shadow moving just beyond the firelight. I froze, swinging the flashlight, but nothing was there. I realized it could have been a deer or a fox, but my fear twisted it into something bigger. Every sound amplified. My mind ran through escape strategies. Running to the car, climbing a tree, finding a cliff or rock to defend myself, but nothing felt safe. Finally, I remembered a small river not far from the meadow. Water would give me both a direction and cover, maybe even safety if I could move silently. I waited until the movement around the clearing seemed minimal, then packed my tent and supplies quietly, careful not to make noise. My heart was in my throat, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I moved slowly at first, then faster when I felt unseen eyes on me, moving from shadow to shadow, staying low. The darkness was suffocating, but I kept my flashlight pointed at the ground, avoiding drawing attention. I reached the river after what felt like hours, but was likely 30 or 40 minutes. The sound of flowing water was a relief. I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead me back to a road or trail. My legs ached. My hands were scraped and bloody from brambles, but I kept going. The forest seemed endless, but moving along the river gave me direction. Every now and then, I would hear snapping branches or movement behind me. I would freeze, heart in my throat, imagining the worst. But the sound never came closer. It always stayed distant. I realized it might have been a wild animal circling, curious, or maybe just the wind. Whatever it was, it hadn't attacked. Hours passed. I followed the river until finally, at dawn, the trees began to thin, and I could see the first signs of a dirt road in the distance. Exhausted, battered, and scared beyond words, I stumbled onto the road. A car passed by, and I flagged it down, collapsing into the passenger seat, shaking. I gave the driver the address to the nearest ranger station. At the station, I reported what had happened, detailing the location, the sounds, the movement. They listened, nodded, and said it was probably a bear or maybe a large pack of coyotes, but there was no proof. They told me to be careful, that the forest was unpredictable, especially for someone traveling alone. I left the forest that day, every step heavy with relief and exhaustion. I realized how fragile my sense of safety had been, how quickly solitude could become fear. The experience stayed with me for months. How the darkness amplified sound, how every shadow seemed to move with intent, how fear made hours stretch into eternity. I never returned to that part of the forest. I never camped alone in deep woods again. But I also knew something important. I survived because I stayed calm, observed carefully, and moved with caution. I learned to respect the forest not as a playground, but as a living, unpredictable place where even one misstep can turn a simple trip into a nightmare. Looking back, I can see it clearly. The preparation that helped me survive, the mistakes I avoided, the small decisions that saved me. The fear was real, but so was the relief at the end. I wasn't attacked, I wasn't lost forever, and I made it back to safety. The story isn't one of monsters or myths. It's a story of survival, of understanding the thin line between comfort and danger in the wilderness, and of respecting the raw power of nature and the unknown in its silence. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I wanted something far away from any crowded campgrounds, something isolated, where I could really feel alone in the woods. I spent days researching trails, maps, and weather reports. I packed everything I thought I might need: a tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a small stove, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I also brought a compact bear spray canister, a pocket knife, and a few basic tools. I was careful, meticulous, almost obsessive in my preparation, but nothing could prepare me for what was about to happen. The trailhead I chose was in a forested area that extended for miles without any roads or houses nearby. When I arrived early in the morning, the air was still cool and damp. The smell of pine and wet earth filled my lungs. I started my hike with a light pack, planning to leave my heavier items in a backpack I would set up at the campsite later. The first few miles were serene. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating patterns on the dirt path. Birds called to one another, and occasionally, I would see a squirrel dart across the trail or a deer standing frozen for a moment before disappearing into the underbrush. The kind of calm that makes you feel small and careful, yet completely free. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I decided to take a break. I found a rock near a shallow stream and sat down, pulling out my water bottle and a granola bar. I refilled my bottle with filtered water from the stream, watching the bubbles rise as I poured it. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint sound of running water. I took deep breaths and let myself relax. Up until that point, everything felt perfect. I thought about how peaceful it was, how far from civilization I was, and how lucky I was to find a spot like this. After a short break, I continued along the trail, looking for a campsite. By the afternoon, I came across a narrow ridge that overlooked a small valley. The ground was relatively flat and dry, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. It was perfect. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the tent pegs were secure and the rain flap was positioned correctly, even though the forecast had no rain. I arranged my gear inside, checked my food supply, and built a small fire pit outside the tent with stones I found nearby. The firewood I gathered was dry enough to burn well. I made sure to stack extra wood close by in case I needed it through the night. As the sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows through the trees, I started my fire. I cooked a small meal over it, enjoying the warmth on my hands and the smell of sizzling food. Sitting by the fire, I felt an unusual sense of solitude, but it was also slightly unnerving. There was a deep, almost oppressive silence in the forest. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a quiet that made you notice every small sound. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant gurgle of the stream. Every sound seemed amplified. I shook the feeling off, telling myself I was just imagining things because I was alone. Night came quickly. The forest darkened around me, the trees forming black silhouettes against the sky. I lay in my tent for a while, listening to the forest noises. Owls hooted in the distance, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. Around midnight, I decided to check the fire, making sure it hadn't died completely. As I looked up from the pit, I thought I saw a shadow moving near the edge of the clearing. My heart rate quickened, but I reminded myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. I stayed close to the fire and kept it alive, feeling slightly safer with its warmth and light. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but I heard it clearly once I focused. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow, measured, like someone was moving cautiously toward the clearing. My first instinct was disbelief. Who could be out here at this hour, miles from the nearest road? My body froze. My mind raced through possibilities. Other hikers, hunters, someone who had gotten lost. But none of them made sense. I grabbed my flashlight and bear spray, trying not to breathe too loudly. I shined the light outside the tent, sweeping it across the clearing. Nothing. I waited, listening, heart hammering. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, crunching on the fallen leaves and dry twigs. I kept the flashlight steady, scanning every inch of the clearing. Then I saw a figure, just barely visible in the dim light from the dying fire. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I couldn't make out details, just a silhouette, but I could see the figure wasn't moving. They were just standing there, silent, observing. My stomach twisted with fear. I was trapped in my tent with a stranger outside. My mind raced, calculating options. I could try to escape on foot, but the forest was dense, and I had no way to know if the person was armed. The safest place was to stay inside the tent, quiet and hidden, until they left, or until daylight. I didn't move for what felt like hours, gripping my bear spray and knife, listening to every noise. The person didn't approach, didn't leave. The tension was unbearable. Then, without warning, I heard a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. This was no human sound. My flashlight beam swept the clearing again, but the figure was gone. I realized it wasn't a person I had seen before. It had been a large animal, a bear. The first figure, the shadow I thought I had seen near the trees, had been the outline of a bear, large and imposing. The footsteps, the growl, the movement, everything added up. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I had never been this close to a wild animal like this, and now I knew I had to act carefully. I remembered the safety instructions I had read. Never run from a bear. Make yourself appear larger. Stay calm. Speak in a low voice. Slowly back away. But I was in a tent, and the bear was outside. Couldn't back away. I stayed still, holding my flashlight and spray, trying not to make any noise. The growl came again, closer this time. The bear had circled the clearing. I could hear it sniffing around the perimeter, sniffing the ground near my tent. I realized the smell of my food might have drawn it here. I cursed myself for cooking dinner so close to the sleeping area. I was trapped. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I knew that would be deadly. The bear spent what felt like an eternity sniffing around the clearing, pacing back and forth, circling the tent. I stayed completely still, holding my breath whenever it came too close. My hands were trembling, my body soaked in sweat despite the cold night air. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I couldn't tell if the bear was searching for food or just investigating, but I knew any sudden movement could provoke it. I reminded myself that bears usually leave if they don't find food quickly, that they don't typically attack humans unprovoked. I kept repeating this to myself, trying to remain calm, but my fear was intense, almost paralyzing. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 20 minutes, the bear moved away from the tent, sniffing along the edge of the clearing. I didn't dare move, not even to glance outside. I could hear it walking toward the tree line, leaves crunching beneath its paws. My pulse gradually slowed as the sounds faded into the distance. I waited another 10 or 15 minutes before I dared to move. My body was stiff and aching, and my hands were raw from gripping my knife and spray canister. I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The bear was gone. I could hear the forest settling back into its usual nighttime noises, the wind through the trees and the occasional distant call of an owl. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire with the flashlight in one hand and bear spray in the other, too scared to let myself relax. The forest was alive with shadows and sounds, each one making me jump. I tried to eat a little more food, drank water, and stayed alert, knowing that daylight was the only thing that would make me feel safe. I stayed awake, tense, every sense focused on the forest around me. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I felt a small sense of relief, though I knew the forest still held dangers. I packed up my tent carefully, keeping my gear close, and extinguished the fire completely. I left no trace of my presence, moving quickly but cautiously, aware that the bear or other wildlife could still be nearby. I retraced my steps along the trail, constantly scanning the trees, listening for unusual sounds. Every stick snapping under my boots made me jump, but by late morning, I emerged from the dense forest onto a familiar dirt road that led to the trailhead. I could see cars parked there, people moving around. The sound of human activity was almost overwhelming after the silence of the forest. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as I loaded my pack into my car. My hands still shook slightly from the night's terror, and my mind replayed every sound, every shadow, every heartbeat. But I had survived. I had been careful, alert, and lucky. I drove home slowly, replaying the experience in my mind, realizing how fragile safety could be when you were alone in the wild. I made a silent promise to myself. I would never underestimate the forest again, and I would always respect the power of nature. When I finally reached home, I unpacked my gear, cleaned everything carefully, and sat down with a long shower to wash off the physical and mental tension. The fear lingered for a while, but it was tempered by a deep sense of accomplishment. I had faced something terrifying, something that could have ended badly, and I had survived. The forest was dangerous, yes, but I had learned more about myself and my limits than I ever could have imagined. I had gone into the woods to find solitude and peace, but I came back with a respect for the raw unpredictability of nature, a memory that would stay with me forever, and a story that was frightening but ultimately one of survival. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything: the city, the noise, the people, the endless work. I had read about this forest online, far from the main roads, with little human presence. The pictures looked perfect: tall pine trees, small clearings, a river winding through the woods. I wanted solitude, silence, and something that felt untouched. I didn't care about comfort. I didn't care about luxury. I only wanted the wilderness, raw and unbroken, and I wanted it alone. I left early on a Friday morning, my car packed with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a stove, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a flashlight that I had charged the night before. I also carried a small hand axe, not for hunting, just for cutting wood or clearing a path if needed. I didn't expect danger. I only expected nature and the peace it offered. But I also knew enough to carry tools, to be careful, to respect the environment. The drive was long, the road becoming less paved, then just dirt, then barely a track until my GPS said I had arrived. I got out of the car, stretched, and took in the sight of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet, and the air was crisp, cold in a way that made me feel alive. I loved it immediately. I set up my camp in a small clearing near the river. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the river flowed quietly, smooth and steady. I pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and stacked firewood I had gathered from nearby dead trees. By afternoon, I had a fire going, a small circle of stones around it to keep it contained. I cooked some canned beans, drank water from my bottle, and sat back to listen to the forest. There were birds, of course, and squirrels, and the occasional rustle of something larger moving through the trees. I watched as sunlight pierced the canopy in thin beams, falling on moss and rocks, making everything glisten. I felt perfectly at ease. By evening, the air had dropped. I added more wood to the fire and sat close to it, the warmth against my face comforting. The sky darkened, stars appearing one by one. I had a flashlight, but I didn't need it yet. The sounds of the forest grew louder in the dark. The crack of twigs, distant bird calls, the river gurgling. I felt completely alone, but not in a way that scared me. Alone in nature is different. It is a calm, self-contained kind of solitude. But as the night deepened, I started to notice things I hadn't during the day. Shadows moved differently. The wind made sounds that felt like footsteps. Every time I heard a snap of a branch, my heart jumped. I told myself it was nothing, just small animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I laughed quietly to myself, trying to ignore the growing tension in my chest. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. My fire had dwindled, though I was sure I had stacked enough wood. I added more logs, but the wind had picked up, cold and harsh, rustling the branches above me. I huddled closer, pulling my jacket tight. That's when I heard it. A sound unlike anything else in the forest. A low, steady crunching, like someone walking through dry leaves, slow and deliberate. My eyes darted toward the tree line. I shone my flashlight, but the beam only lit up shadows, nothing moving. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to get up and run. But I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a bear moving far enough away that it sounded closer than it was. Bears could be dangerous, sure, but I had read enough to know that making noise and keeping calm usually kept them away. I grabbed my axe and sat upright, firelight reflecting off the metal. I listened. The sound stopped, then restarted, closer this time. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was definitely moving toward me. Not running, not like a deer would. Just walking, slow and careful, deliberate. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the tree line, and for the first time I saw movement. Something or someone was stepping between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't cautious either. Felt methodical. I thought about calling the police, but I had no cell signal. None. My mind raced. Could it be someone camping illegally, drunk, or careless? Or worse, my thoughts jumped to every horror scenario I had ever read about. I gripped the axe tighter, trying to stay calm, listening to every sound. The crunching stopped, as if the figure had frozen, and then I heard a low whistle, soft, almost a laugh. My stomach dropped. I realized then how vulnerable I was. Alone, miles from the nearest road, no signal, in a tent that offered no real protection. I considered trying to run to my car, but it was far, and the dark forest is easy to get lost in. I also had food and water, which would buy me time if this went on. I made a plan. Stay low, keep the fire alive, and wait for daylight if I could. I pulled the tent flap closed, leaving a small opening to watch, and kept the axe beside me. Every minute felt like an hour. I tried to keep my breathing steady, to control the panic that threatened to take over. The wind gusted, the fire sputtered, and I watched as shadows danced on the trees. Then I heard the crunch again, and I knew it was closer. It had circled the clearing, I realized with horror, and now was on the opposite side. I could see movement, faint through the darkness. I whispered to myself, even though no one could hear, that I had to stay calm, that I had to survive the night. I spent hours like that, listening, watching, waiting. I threw small sticks into the fire to keep it going, the flames flaring briefly, shadows leaping like monsters. I tried to imagine what this person, if it was a person, wanted. Food? My car? Something worse? My mind wouldn't stop spinning scenarios, each one more terrifying. But I stayed quiet, moving only when necessary, careful not to make sounds. The person or animal, though it didn't sound like any animal I knew, never made a move directly toward me. They stayed at the edge, circling, watching, waiting, I imagined, and I stayed frozen, hoping they would leave. Night seemed endless, the dark stretching in every direction, pressing in, suffocating, my fear growing with each passing hour. Finally, the first signs of light crept into the sky, pale gray and weak. I stayed still, listening. The crunching had stopped. I slowly peeked outside the tent. Nothing. No movement. I waited a few more minutes, heart hammering. Then slowly, carefully, I stepped out. My fire was nearly gone. Smoldering embers, the only warmth in the cold morning. My camp was undisturbed. Nothing had been touched. But the ground around me told the story. Footprints. Large, heavy, human footprints circling my camp. They were fresh, deep in the soft earth, clearly left during the night. My stomach turned. Whoever had been here had been around me, circling, watching, testing. They had stayed far enough not to attack, close enough to terrify. And then, with the first light, they had vanished, gone into the forest, leaving me alone. I stayed put until the sun rose fully. Then I packed everything quickly, not wanting to wait another minute. I took extra care to leave no trace, but I checked my perimeter constantly. I avoided the trees, kept my eyes on the shadows, and moved faster than I had in years. The drive back to the main road was tense. Every sound, every movement in the trees made my pulse jump. I kept my hands on the wheel, eyes scanning constantly, expecting someone to emerge from the woods at any moment. But I made it. The dirt track ended, then the paved road, then civilization. Lights, houses, people walking dogs. Normal life. Safe life. I felt like I could finally breathe again. When I got home, I called the police and reported what had happened. They said it could have been a trespasser or a hunter, maybe someone observing campers. They asked for details, which I gave, including the footprints. They promised to patrol the area, though I knew little could be done for something that had already passed through. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. Relief for surviving, fear that it could happen again. But I also felt stronger, sharper, alive in a way that only facing real danger can make you feel. I had prepared, I had stayed calm, and I had survived the night. That knowledge, that certainty, became a quiet comfort over the days that followed. I never went back to that campsite. I never will. But I kept everything I had learned from that night in my mind. I learned the value of vigilance, the importance of preparation, the necessity of keeping your mind focused under fear. And I also learned something more personal. That solitude, as peaceful as it may seem, can turn into terror very quickly, and that surviving it requires more than courage. It requires awareness, planning, and patience. I survived, and that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how real danger can exist in the most beautiful places, and how fragile human life can feel in the middle of the wilderness, far from anyone else. Years later, I still think about that night. Sometimes I drive past the edge of that forest, the road empty, the trees dark and silent. I feel the same tension rise, but also pride. I survived. I kept calm when everything in me wanted to panic. I made it through the dark, the silence, the fear, and I carry that knowledge with me every time I go into the wild. It's not fantasy, it's not ghosts. It's real, and surviving it matters more than anything. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. Respect it, prepare for it, and above all, never underestimate how alone you can be. That night taught me that, and it taught me that I can endure, even when terror creeps close enough to touch me.